I was going to start by asking you a question. Would you put a hand up if you do not subscribe in some way, either to Facebook or to Twitter or to Amazon or to an online grocer? Anyone not subscribed? Yeah, a very small minority of people in the room. If I can be forgiven for saying so, mostly from the older group of people in the room, in which, of course, I would include myself. I ask that question because what I want to propose to you at the outset is actually the real surrender of privacy in this country has been entirely voluntary. Most people have volunteered to give their innermost secrets to almost anyone who cares to access them, particularly if they subscribe to Facebook or Twitter. We find out if our 19-year-old undergraduate child has a boyfriend or not by people telling us, we never look ourselves, whether she is single or not on her Facebook entry. So the world knows. When, as I do, I buy a book, either for my iPad or Kindle or a real book on Amazon, it immediately suggests to me other books I might like to read because it knows the sorts of books I read. My wife, Alison Levitt, and I are very, very busy people, so we get all our groceries online, almost all our groceries online. And when, and I admit it is Alison who makes the grocery orders usually, she goes on to, I think it's ocado.com, which is connected with Waitrose. There's a list that they create automatically, which tells us what we want to eat, because we've been with them now for several years and they know our pattern of eating. They almost decide what we eat on any particular night of the week. So when the state is accused of making a massive interference with our liberties, let's put it in that context, which I propose to you is that most people have surrendered their privacy voluntarily, probably without realizing it. I've another question to ask you. Anne Huxley was Liverpool's leading brothel madam, and she was a bit fed up with her ex-husband, so she hired a hitman to murder him, and very messy it was too. He was shot dead in a warehouse just on the push side of the Mersey Tunnel, on the Wirral. It was a very unpleasant case because quite a lot of him, and I won't go into detail, was on the wall after he'd been shot. And the person who shot him, the hitman, who had been paid, if I remember rightly, £20,000 to do this job, which shows that she was doing very nicely with her madaming, was arrested, and he admitted he'd committed the murder, and he pleaded guilty to murder. And during the course of his questioning, it appeared from what he said that Anne Huxley may have been the person who hired him to commit the murder. But Anne Huxley is a tough woman. And when the police interviewed her, she had absolutely nothing to say. There was no evidence to be found in her house. There were no relevant bank transactions because, of course, well, I say of course, maybe some of you who know more about this than me, but I gathered from the case that if you're a brothel madam, you do most of your transactions in cash. So there was very, very little objective evidence against her. And a bright-eyed detective sergeant thought, well, let's go to the mobile phone providers and let's start looking at her mobile phone records. Anne Huxley wanted to make sure, and had wanted to make sure, that her former husband was really dead. So after he'd been killed, she went over through the Mersey Tunnel to the garage premises where the person she had hired as hitman went after committing the murder. Many months after the murder had been committed, cell site analysis of her mobile phone and of the murderers could show how she left her home in her car and went along a certain route through the Mersey Tunnel, and they could pinpoint her phone to within 30 meters of the garage where he had his headquarters. And so as a result, and I'm afraid I had the privilege of defending her, she was charged with conspiracy to murder and she got 20 years. Now, does anybody here think that the use of that cell site analysis was wrong? I didn't think anyone would think that was wrong. Let me try another one on you. Stuart Crittenden was a 63-year-old middle-class financial advisor from Cheltenham. And he was extremely respectable. He'd never done anything wrong in his life, and he had a good client list. Among his client list was a lady in Macclesfield in Cheshire, which is, I guess, about 170 miles from Cheltenham. And she was found dead in her bed one morning, and her body was the subject of an autopsy, and the local coroner decided that she died of natural causes. She was in her early 80s. She left a moderate sum of money, which had been depleted in the year before her death by £387,000. And there was some doubt as to where this £387,000 had gone, and she had records of dealings with her financial advisor, Stuart Crittenden. So the police interviewed Mr. Crittenden, and they could find no evidence against him. The case was put to rest after the autopsy that said that she died of natural causes. But about a year later, and many of the best, as Mr. Fuller, who's a former Chief Constable of Kent in the front row here, will confirm, many of the best police officers in the known world are detective sergeants, aren't they, Mike? And a detective sergeant went to his chief superintendent and he said, I'm really unhappy about that case, I want to have another look at it. And his chief superintendent said, all right, as long as you don't spend too much time on it, because we've got plenty of burglaries to deal with around Macclesfield, have another look at it. And he started to do some cell site analysis by going to the mobile phone companies with which Mr. Crittenden had his phone. And then he had the bright idea of going and looking at the motorway cameras. And he looked in a motorway camera which was actually 1 hour out because it was in a concrete box that didn't respond to the Derby clock that automatically changes the time when the time changes, as I believe it will this Saturday night. And it was found that at 3:30 one particular morning, and you will not be surprised to know that it's the night before the lady was found dead, Mr. Crittenden's car was automatic number plate recognized by a camera over the M5 motorway. And so they followed up the cell site analysis and the cameras on other motorways, obviously looking into what turned out to be a very private journey indeed by Mr. Crittenden. And then they interviewed him under caution. They were very fair, the police. And the detective sergeant, who by this stage was actually rather enjoying himself, said to Mr. Crittenden, I'm going to administer the caution to you again, Mr. Crittenden, because I'm going to ask you a very important question. Where were you on the night of, and he named that night? And Mr. Crittenden said, I was in bed in Cheltenham with my wife. Where was your car? It was in the carport. Are you absolutely sure? Certainly. Did anyone else use your car during that week? Oh no, nobody else uses my car apart from myself and my wife. This enabled me, when I started my cross-examination as prosecutor of Mr. Crittenden, to say to him, Mr. Crittenden, help my lord and the jury, were there car-driving Martians in Cheltenham on that particular night. And Mr. Crittenden was convicted of murder of the lady from whom he had stolen £387,000. Now, does anyone think that invasion of Mr. Crittenden's privacy was wrong? I thought you might not. So, you know, before we get too excited about civil liberties arguments, and they are, of course, very important, let's just be proportionate about the way in which investigation of otherwise private activities of people every single day of the year is used to detect serious crime. Now, I've just given you two examples of cases in which cell site analysis, metadata relating to private calls, not the contents of the calls, has been used to convict criminals. There is barely a case that is contested in the Crown Court these days in which there is a dispute about the facts in which mobile telephony does not play an important part in the evidence. And it's not just murder cases. I've seen it happen in enormous detail internationally in fraud cases. I've seen it done in police corruption cases, and indeed right across the criminal calendar. Now I turn to David Miranda and The Guardian. You will recall that David Miranda was detained under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act at Heathrow Airport. And his detention was the subject of enormous protest, particularly by The Guardian newspaper. The Guardian, of course, was in possession of a huge number of emails which had been acquired by Edward Snowden. And as I reminded you, he was detained and questioned under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, which gives the police the power to stop someone at a port, and as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, I've observed this being done, indeed, by the Kent police when Mike Fuller was the Chief Constable of Kent, because, of course, Kent has the Channel Tunnel and Dover Harbour, amongst other things. I've seen it done in Sussex, at Gatwick Airport. Indeed, I witnessed a very, very interesting Schedule 7 stop at Gatwick Airport, which didn't reveal that the person stopped was a terrorist, but as I observed it and I sat in on his interview, it probably revealed that he was a spy trying to enter this country from another country which I'm not able to mention. And so I've seen Schedule 7 used to considerable effect myself. Now let's consider what the duty of the state is. What is the first duty of the state? Well, I would suggest to you that the first duty of the state, surely, is to keep its citizens safe. And what does national security mean? It's a phrase that's bandied about and rarely defined. Well, I will try and define it for you. In my view, national security really means the right of each of the 63 million people now living in the United Kingdom to live our lives without fear of terrorism or other serious crime. Now let's just talk about the background for a moment. And we heard Andrew Parker, the new director of the Security Service, say it very recently. We heard his predecessor, Jonathan Evans, say it publicly. We heard his predecessor, Baroness Manningham-Buller, as she now is, say it previously. We heard Sir John Soares, the head of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, say it. We heard his predecessor, Sir John Scarlett, say it. We've heard Sir Malcolm Rifkin, the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, say it. They have all said, and I've said it too as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, that there is a dangerous reality that we face. Some of the worst carnage of the 7th of July 2005 when 52 innocent people were killed by 4 suicide bombers on London's buses and tube trains, happened just a few hundred yards from the desk where I was writing my notes for this lecture. And we know that some equally ghastly plots have been detected and others disrupted. At the time of the Glasgow airport bomb plot, because the bomber, or the putative bomber, failed to let enough oxygen into the vehicle by not opening a window slightly, a club called Tiger on Haymarket was not the subject of a bomb attack when it was occupied by 300 or so dancing females. Had the bomber not made that mistake, probably 50 or 60 of those young women would have been killed. So we know that some ghastly crimes have been detected and others disrupted as a result of the use, as happened in that case, of surveillance and, in many cases, metadata. The who contacted whom, from where and when, but not the contents of the calls themselves. Sometimes calls are intercepted, of course, but in order for calls to be intercepted, there has to be a special warrant granted by a very senior figure, a retired Court of Appeal, recently retired Court of Appeal judge, who has to be satisfied on the basis of the information given to him, for it's a he at the moment, that it's justified. We also know that the most serious crimes, especially terrorism and spying against our interests, require a great deal of secret investigation. The people who work for the secret services, brave people, and the police who work alongside them must be protected against the irresponsible exposure both of their identities and of the techniques that they are able to use. Also, the most valuable sources for undercover policing are what are called CHISs, covert human intelligence sources. Every police force in the country has CHISs, and the way in which CHISs are run is, used not to be, but these days it's very well supervised and works extremely well in providing information on very serious crimes. And of course, if CHISs are exposed, it is inevitable that their lives will be in danger. David Miranda, his partner Glenn Greenwald, who's a journalist for The Guardian, Edward Snowden and The Guardian claim to be virtuous whistleblowers. Their virtue apparently includes travelling the world and publishing or seeking to publish secrets collected by the UK and other countries to protect their citizens. What kind of virtue, I would ask you, is that? Mr. Snowden has provided, and The Guardian has published, material that allegedly shows where and how the UK is functioning against terrorists. Some of that material may be right, and some of that material may be wrong, but that is what he is purporting it is. Is it anything other than criminal to seek to publish such secrets? In my view, most right-thinking people would condemn Mr. Snowden's activities and question the actions of journalists whose newspapers may benefit from his wrongdoing. Of course, the British government had to intervene in the suspected transfer across the world of that kind of material. Mr. Miranda was carrying electronic equipment, apparently including an electronic games device that could have contained a mass of secret information in digital form. Its publication could have resulted in disastrous undermining of the legitimate efforts of secret investigations, perhaps putting back for years the struggle against worldwide political violence. How could David Cameron or Theresa May have vetoed a search that might have protected Londoners from another bus or tube bombing? So the real concern about Mr. Miranda is actually a rather technical one. It's not whether it was right for Mr. Miranda to be stopped at Heathrow Airport. The issue is whether he was stopped under the correct provisions. The Guardian's acceptance of the demand made by the government originally that they should destroy information that they had demonstrates clearly their recognition that they'd come into possession of national security material of high importance. And if they knew that, one must question whether, as a supposedly responsible newspaper, they should have accepted it in the first place. There is a further tranche of Snowden material which the Guardian has not only refused to hand over, but has sent to another country so that the British authorities could not take possession of it, even if they wanted to. Now, I do think that there is criticism to be made of the police about the search of Mr. Miranda. I think they were rather kind to him. They stopped him under Schedule 7. They questioned him. They held him for a period of hours, which, if it had been a correct Schedule 7 stop, they were entitled to do. And they let him go. And off he went to his home, which is in Brazil. In my view, what they should have done, what the police should have done, was obtain some sound legal advice, which is fairly readily available. Not least, they could have got it from the Crown Prosecution Service, though I may be a bit biased, as my wife is the principal legal advisor to the Director of Public Prosecutions. They could have got it from Treasury Counsel. They could have got it from a legal advisor at Scotland Yard. Perhaps they should have got the Attorney General out of a dinner party or bed, or the Solicitor General, and they might have obtained some advice. And if they'd obtained that advice, I think they would have been advised that Mr. Snowden should be treated far less gently than being stopped under Schedule 7. They should have arrested him for a conspiracy, alleged conspiracy, to breach Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act, which would have considerably delayed his journey to Brazil and would have enabled a full criminal investigation to take place, as, in my view, it should. Now, I've dwelt on Mr. Miranda's case, not because I came to talk about the Miranda case, and there are legal steps being taken now, I believe, in relation to the Guardian, or at least legal advice is being obtained, and possibly in relation to Mr. Miranda, Mr. Greenwald, and Mr. Snowden. But it is an illustration of how dangerously we fall into the trap of assuming that newspapers are virtuous, that whistleblowers, as they sometimes style themselves, are all good, and that it is in the public interest for what the secret world does to be exposed. Let me just, so I don't appear to you to be a dyed-in-the-wool securocrat, because I've never been employed by or paid by MI5, MI6, or any other security-based organization. My role in the security world has always been independent. I think that the government does fail in a number of respects, and this is not a political point. This is a point against the two governments, the present one and its predecessor, for which I was independent reviewer of terrorism legislation for a period. First, they keep too many secrets secret. In my view, in counter-terrorism, narrative is very important, and government does not give a sufficient narrative. There was a great professor of these issues at St Andrews University, now deceased, and he said to me on the first occasion I met him, you know that 90% of the secret material's on the internet anyway, you just need to know where to look for it. And you know, if that is true, and maybe he was exaggerating a little, but not much, I think that governments could give a much greater narrative of what is being investigated, what techniques are being used to investigate it, the quantity of warrants being used to actually intercept communications, and the way in which metadata is used. My own party leader, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, vetoed the Communications Data Bill, which would have put onto a more regular and organised footing obligations which this country has had under European Union treaty for a number of years anyway. A bill that would have organised the retention of metadata in a standardised form and for a standard period of time, and would have ensured that there was quality control over the way in which it was used. The independent reviewer of terrorism legislation now, my successor, David Anderson QC, is an absolutely brilliant lawyer, but he's got an awful lot to do, and there is no way in which he, or I as his predecessor, could look at the use of metadata by police forces from the northeast to the tip of Cornwall, including, of course, some very big metropolitan police forces who use it all the time. So my call is that government should give a much better narrative. There is no subject on which MPs, and I have been one myself, and I'm far from one of those people who runs down MPs. I believe that 95% of MPs work extremely hard and actually do a much better job than they're given credit for, and by the way, are also grossly underpaid if you compare what they do with equivalent occupations. But most MPs know absolutely nothing about MI5, MI6, GCHQ, or foreign intelligence services. They read what they read in the newspapers, indeed mostly I suspect from the Daily Mail online website, which I'm told is the most popular newspaper website in the world. If you want to read the news as it comes out every day, just click on the Daily Mail's website. It's very, very entertaining as well. Often biased, but there we are. We know that of the Mail. And my view is that we must try and keep a sense of proportion. Let me give you an example of what could really go wrong in this country. And this isn't really about privacy, but it's an illustration. Supposing that the intelligence service of an extremely nasty country, somewhere far away from here, which occasionally uses torture, were to hear that there was information that there was going to be an aircraft bomb flown into Manchester United football ground on the following Saturday or Sunday in the middle of a match. And they informed the British intelligence services. But the British intelligence services knew that this country uses torture from time to time and that the material is liable to be unreliable. Now, we don't condone torture in this country. Evidence obtained by torture is completely inadmissible in a UK court. But what should the authorities do with that piece of information? Should they shrug their shoulders and say, well, you know, this comes from a very nasty place, we're not going to do anything about it. If they did that, and there was a bomb at Manchester United football ground the following Saturday or Sunday, I can tell you what would happen to the government. It would fall. It wouldn't last the following week, even if it had a majority of 150 in the House of Commons. And, you know, we do have to give that priority, that paramountcy, to the protection of the public when we are looking at the proportionality of the invasion of privacy. Now, let me, before I answer questions, just finish by saying the following. In my view, it is imperative that public authorities should obey the law. If they do not obey the law, they should be prosecuted and disciplined. It's as simple as that. Nor should they use the law of other countries to get around our own law. That has been suggested recently, but what we've been told by the Prime Minister, who presumably was acting on legal advice that had been given to him, and by the chairman of the Intelligence Services Committee, the very punctilious Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who is a former Foreign Secretary, is that that has not happened. We do have to trust somebody. And, you know, I've been involved in politics. I was in the House of Commons for 14 years. I left, I hasten to say, voluntarily in 1997, returned to Parliament in 1999. So I've been knocking around the political world for 30 years. And I spent a great deal of that time involved in issues around terrorism and secrecy, and I still am. And I do not believe that there is any evidence of a malevolent government in this country. We have a tradition of honourable attorneys general, and we have a tradition of honourable security services. I don't believe that anybody has produced any convincing evidence to the contrary. I believe that as long as we scrutinise it carefully and we have all kinds of checks and balances, the invasions of privacy by the authorities in this country are at least as legitimate as those in any other country in the world. And I think that we've got to be proud of, a lot to be proud of. That said, I welcome the debates. I think we're very lucky to have organisations like Liberty and Human Rights Watch in this country. I was in Spain on one occasion, in Madrid, looking at the way they try terrorism cases there. And on my way to the airport, I accepted an invitation to go to a newspaper office to meet the editor. And I went into this chaotic newspaper office, and I went into it was very old-fashioned, I went into the editor's glass booth, which was right in the middle of the journalist's floor. And he said to me, "Why do the British get so excited about invasions of privacy and terrorism cases? We probably give a claim like you've had recently, some great scandal had blown up, maybe an inch in one of our side columns." And I said to him, well, we're different countries. I'm proud that these people, that these organisations, indeed I used to be a member of the board of the old National Council of Civil Liberties at one time. I'm proud that they and Human Rights Watch do argue these cases in the United Kingdom. But I don't think on the whole that they're right, and I don't think on the whole that they're realistic in their analysis, insofar as they're able to make it, of what is done in the name of the British state. So what I finally propose to you is that, of course, we should be concerned about invasions of privacy in this country, but that the evidence against the UK government and authorities is very thin indeed in terms of allegations of breach. And I'd be delighted to take your questions.